I'm sure you're familiar, all of you, with the Data Protection Directive and the Data Protection Act implementing that here. And as you'll know, data security under the existing legislation is not particularly verbose or prescriptive. In fact, I've managed to pretty much summarise it in 4 bullets there. I suppose this is understandable. Back when the directive was drafted in the early 90s, it was prior to the adoption, or the mainstream adoption, I should say, of the World Wide Web. It was certainly well before the proliferation of internet technologies that we now have and the proliferation of data collection and processing, whether it's cloud, media, social media, whether it's mobile computing, you name it. So understandable that at the time it was felt that we should only address data security in a generic set of statements. But what we have, of course, at the moment is the key provision, which is currently the 7th data protection principle, will become the 5th in the GDPR, and that is to take appropriate technical and organisational measures to prevent or avoid the unauthorised or unlawful processing, accidental loss or destruction or damage to data. So the key word with all of this is appropriate. What are the appropriate measures that you should be taking to prevent this data loss or unauthorised access? And the way that the directive and the DPA talks about this is it looks at, you have to look at the nature of the data itself and the harm that might result from the breach. So, for example, if you're holding very innocuous public domain data which wouldn't really impact on the privacy of an individual if it were lost, then you would be required to take less stringent measures and spend less money on protecting that data than if it's sensitive medical data, clearly. So it's a risk-based approach even now, and that doesn't change, as we'll see. There are also obligations to ensure the reliability of your employees who process personal data, and where you're bringing in a third-party data processor, do your due diligence on them, make sure that they have appropriate security in place. Have to have a written contract, of course. We're all used to putting in place controller-processor contracts and have been for years, where, once you've done your due diligence, you have a contract with certain minimum provisions in there which require you to, which require the processor, I should say, to only act on your instructions and to comply with this 7th principle themselves. So you flow down the liability in the contract, but of course, as we know at the moment, the processor isn't liable. If you are a telco or an ISP, there's an additional layer of current regulation, of course, under the Privacy and Electronic Communications regs. So if you are what's classed as a public electronic communications service provider, mainly, as I say, limited to telcos, ISPs and email providers, you've got this additional layer. You've still got this phrase, appropriate technical and organisational measures. So that is a common thread. But additionally, if having taken those measures, your subscriber is still potentially at risk from privacy or security issues in relation to their data, then it's the telco's obligation to tell the subscriber and allow them, or give them an opportunity to mitigate that. And crucially, this is where we get the mandatory data breach notification provisions from as well. So at the moment, only telcos and ISPs have to report data breaches by way of law, although, as we all know, the ICO has issued guidance about when it believes other companies should be reporting data breaches. So, over the years, we've had lots of opinions and guidance, despite the fact that what we've got at the moment isn't particularly prescriptive or in detail. We've had a lot of Article 29 opinions on different levels of data security or different issues of data security. We've had a lot of ICO guidance, a lot of it very useful, on breach management, security, notification, encryption. There's a lot of good stuff out there which companies can use. I particularly like a 2014 report, Learning from the Mistakes of Others, which the ICO put out, and which lists the top 8 security vulnerabilities in IT that the ICO has come across, and how to remediate against those. And I thought that's particularly useful for a number of clients. I've sort of said, give that to your IT team as an absolute basic and just ask them whether they've done all of those things. And in fact, a lot of the things that Kwan and Mark were talking about, like SQL injection, hashing and salting of passwords, failure to update patching, etc. All of those things are listed in that report in quite a lot of detail. There are things out there is guidance out there for us. Traditionally, though, or historically, I should say, The undertakings and the fines that have been issued by the ICO, although most of them do tend to relate to data security, most of them have not related to what we might call cybersecurity issues. A lot of them relate to internal human error, whether it's laptops on trains, whether it's sending emails to incorrect recipients, leaving things in bins. These are all internal human error as opposed to external attack. But what we've seen in recent years, particularly since around 2013, is an increase in the frequency of cybersecurity investigations, undertakings and fines. And some of these were listed by Kwan in the previous session. And as I think they explained, a lot of these were caused by basic vulnerabilities, failure to patch, SQL injection, failing to encrypt and the like. And all of these, again, are covered, all of these issues are covered by the ICO's 2014 report. So if the people within these organisations had read and acted on that report, the problem wouldn't have arisen. So I'm not going to go through these in detail, but very happy to kind of look at some of them. But I think what would be useful now is to sort of bring Rowland in at this point, because I think what I'd like to just start off by talking about is the fact that the legislation as we have it now, before we get into the details of GDPR, the legislation as we have it now is a risk-based approach, and that risk-based approach won't change. So companies should be looking at what data they have, mapping it effectively and working out where are the risk areas, where should we be concentrating our admittedly limited resources, and what should we be doing to lock down that data. Now, Rowland, one question I had for you to sort of start the ball rolling is whether you feel that, on your experience in recent years, whether companies do take that risk-based approach, whether they do sort of do that sort of data mapping and analytics before they then come to you, or whether your experience is that people take a kind of one-size-fits-all approach to data security. So they put in a firewall, they put in some antivirus software and various other sort of perimeter defences, but whether you find that there's a degree of, let's just throw some software at it.
So good afternoon, everybody. Well, where do we start with that? I would suggest that many organisations don't do risk management very effectively. They don't actually really understand what the necessary components are to do a risk assessment. So typically every single day we do a risk assessment when we cross the road, but we don't necessarily see it as being a risk assessment. We understand that we as individuals are vulnerable, and if we get hit, something bad might happen. We understand what the threat is, so we understand that cars and trucks might pose a threat. We understand what the impact would be. I might get a broken leg or I might end up in hospital. And we were able to gauge the level of likelihood of that car hitting us by how far away it is. So despite the fact that we do this every single day of our life, we don't do a very good job of it when we're in the work environment. Quite often, one of the challenges is that we don't actually really understand what data it is that we're trying to protect and where that data resides. So I feel a little bit like I need to try and defend some of my IT colleagues. If only it were that simple, if only we could go out and defend from SQL injection and patch all of the systems. Of course, the challenge is what systems, what things to patch, what things should I patch and in what priority. Quite often people don't really understand, one, what data they've got, and secondly, where that data resides. I'll give you a real life example. A number of years ago, we had to do a piece of work for an organisation out in the US that said, we need to do PCI compliance. We've got a whole load of credit cards in our environment, but we don't really know where they are. We don't know what the risk is, and we don't know whether or not we should be treating this PCI compliance program seriously or not. Can you come and help us? So we went out and did some investigations for them over a number of weeks. And we came back and said, you've got 50 million credit cards within your environment. We reported that to the IT department. And about a couple of hours later, we got contacted somebody from their board and said, not happy with this report. This is wrong. There's no chance we've got 50 million records within our environment. You've made some mistakes. We can only have something like 5 million total, because we only do 1 million transactions a year, and we've only been trading for 5 years. And really what the challenge was is that they'd gathered this information, and when systems had been backed up, and upgraded, people had taken copies because they didn't want to lose the data, and they'd copied it over there. And when that system got upgraded, it got copied over there. And when that system got upgraded, it got copied to the systems administrator's machine. And suddenly, the device that they thought that they were protecting over here had data that wasn't just over there, it was over here. And when we move to things like cloud, so that problem becomes even more difficult. So I guess really what I'm saying is we need to first of all understand what data we've got. We need to understand where that data is, and those things in their own right are not straightforward. And then we need to have a more grown-up approach for doing risk management. And I think if we start doing that, we will have a better chance of being able to defend against cyber attack.
Okay, that's reasonable. And have you found that if we think about some of the things that the ICO identified as being really common vulnerabilities, are you finding those on a regular basis? Does your experience reflect the ICO's experience, or would you say, well, actually, when we go into corporates, we see a whole raft of other things that go way beyond this top 8, as if I can call it that?
So we as an organisation do a lot of penetration testing. Actually, that's our main thing that we deliver for organisations. And attackers will typically take the path of least resistance. So if your systems are badly patched, if you've got SQL injection, yes, you can probably assume that those kind of things will mean that you're more likely to have some form of data breach. But of course, if you do patch and if you do mitigate against SQL injection, it doesn't mean that there is no risk. Actually, and as the last presentation suggested, really, people are the weakest link. And you might argue going after your people is probably the more sophisticated approach and the one that's less likely to result in you being detected. If as an attacker, I send a million requests to your web server with lots of different things to what you would normally expect to receive, it's likely that you might pick that up in some form of logs. If, however, I manage to work out who your workforce are through LinkedIn, and I work out who they're married to, who their children are, and I can work out a little bit about their socio-demographic backgrounds, I might be able to send them an email through something like Facebook, which they receive at home. Interestingly, you don't even need to click on a link today in an email to be spearphished. Current vulnerabilities, current attacks rather, allow you simply just to receive the email, and if your email browser is set to auto preview, that might be enough for the threat actor to gather your password hash. Okay? So you don't have to click on anything. All you've got to do is receive it. Now, there are things in the corporate environment that you can do to protect against that, and that information has to be sent out through certain clear channels out to the bad actor. But when you're at home, what's the chances of your firewall preventing that, or your firewalling having the appropriate controls to stop that traffic going out? Probably not so high. So actually, if you want to compromise an organisation, targeting your users when they're at home is something that might yield quite a lot of success. And if you can compromise a user at home and then they take that compromised device into the office, then when you're moving around the office network, you're actually doing so with what looks like your employee's credentials. That means it looks like real access, not an attacker. So I guess really what this means is the attack surface is growing. It is very, very hard to purely defend. And I genuinely would urge all organisations to think about detection as well as response. Many organisations will have response plans, but they don't have a very well-considered view as to how they're going to detect that malicious traffic. How are they going to notice that their X number of million credit cards or PII information has just disappeared from their environment? Are they going to wait for from a customer, a supplier, or regulators to contact them and tell them? Or are they going to do something proactive?